Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today, well, it's really about cutting through the noise and getting straight to the bedrock of engineering, specifically the kind of engineering discipline you need to build truly secure systems.
Exactly.
We're diving into the reference standards, the mathematical proofs, and those critical design decisions that, separate theoretical security from potentially catastrophic failure in the real world.
It's easy, I think, for listeners and maybe even for practitioners to get caught up in the latest zero-day or the flashiest new algorithm.
Right.
But today we're looking at the quiet stuff, the often overlooked scaffolding, those foundational texts and the rigorous standards that really underpin all modern security guarantees. If you're building anything secure, you really must consult the blueprint.
And when we talk about the blueprint, especially in cryptography engineering, that inevitably leads us to the Handbook of Applied Cryptography, HAC as it's known.
Ah, yes. HAC.
Now, this isn't exactly light reading, is it? But its influence is just undeniable. Why is HAC such an indispensable resource for both, the academic researcher and the practicing engineer out there?
Well, HAC represents formalized knowledge. Cryptography is kind of unique because its security rests not on, say, opinion or just implementation complexity, but on actual verifiable mathematical proofs.
Okay.
HAC meticulously formalizes the concepts that everyone in the field has to agree upon. It provides the precise definitions, the properties, the context for things derives straight from number theory. It's the common ground.
So it gives us the shared lexicon, the agreed-upon rules of the game. Can you give us an example? How does this mathematical rigor translate directly into engineering practice? What's a complex concept HAC formalizes that an engineer might rely on daily, maybe without even realizing they're standing on a deep mathematical proof?
Okay, sure. Let's take the core of public key systems, like RSA, for instance. They rely fundamentally on modular arithmetic. HAC rigorously defines the properties of something called the multiplicative group Zindala. Now, this is basically the set of integers less than the nullars that are relatively prime to non.
Okay, relatively prime meaning they don't share common factors other than 1.
Exactly. And you need to know the properties of this group, specifically its structure, its order, to make sure that the keys you generate are actually computationally hard to factor or invert. That's the foundational security premise of so many schemes.
I see.
Without that formal definition, an engineer might, maybe accidentally, choose parameters that make the underlying mathematical problem, well, easy to solve, which defeats the whole purpose.
That makes perfect sense. The math defines the hardness and therefore the security. I also noticed in the outline the explicit mention of concepts like quadratic residues and non-residues, and the use of something called the Jacobi symbol. These sound pretty technical.
They are definitely technical, but they're crucial building blocks. A quadratic residue is, simply put, a number that is congruent to a perfect square modulo, right? HAC defines these precisely because they're used as proof techniques within various schemes. For instance, the modified Rabin public key signature scheme, HAC, details this as algorithm 11.30. It explicitly requires calculating the Jacobi symbol.
And why is the Jacobi symbol such a subtle but critical detail here? What's the catch?
The catch is it exposes a really crucial ambiguity in number theory that an engineer absolutely must be aware of. See, the Jacobi symbol can be calculated pretty easily even when a dollar is a composite, not prime.
Okay.
But you cannot use its result to definitively say if a number is a quadratic residue modulo unless you know for sure that a dollar is prime. If the DILC is composite and the Jacobi symbol happens to be 1, the value isn't necessarily a quadratic residue.
So there's a potential trap there.
A huge one. A failure to recognize this nuance, a nuance that's formalized right there in the reference text, could lead to implementation flaws. Flaws that might allow an attacker to forge a signature because they could exploit a situation where the implementer thought the mathematical guarantees held, but they actually didn't because nano wasn't prime. The text ensures that the engineering team is working with non-ambiguous mathematical realities.
So the engineering is really the practical application of this, unforgiving math. And this brings us neatly to a fundamental security principle that guides all cryptographic design. It's formalized in HAC, note 7.4, Kirchhoff's assumption.
Yes, Kirchhoff's. This is the non-negotiable principle. It basically states that to properly evaluate the security of something, you must assume the adversary knows every single detail of the encryption function.
Every detail. The algorithm, the key.
Everything. Algorithm, the key derivation process, the permutations of the specific S boxes used, all of it. Everything except the secret key itself. The only secret in a truly secure system is the key.
And this directly contradicts that, frankly, dangerous philosophy of security by obscurity, right? where you hope an attacker just won't find the flaw because the code is kept secret.
Exactly. That's just hoping. Secrecy of the algorithm itself is a design flaw, not a security feature. Kirchhoff's assumption forces engineers to build systems whose security demonstrably relies only on the computational difficulty of recovering that key, often leveraging the hardness of those mathematical problems we just talked about, like factoring or discrete logs.
So open design, open scrutiny.
That is the strongest defense, because it essentially crowdsources the security audit. Many eyes looking for flaws.
Okay, that foundation of open scrutiny leads us naturally to standardized primitives. These are the building blocks engineers use every day. And we really have to discuss the historical significance of the data encryption standard, DES, kind of set the stage for how we evaluate all symmetric ciphers today.
DES is an absolutely incredible case study. Developed back in the 1970s based on IBM's Lucifer cipher, it became the first major symmetric standard used globally.
And its internal structure was pretty complex for the time.
Oh yeah, a 16-round Feistel network. It used key transformation, taking the 56-bit key and generating different subkeys for each round, alongside these intricate processes like expansion permutations, compression permutations, basically lots of mixing and mangling of the 64-bit data blocks.
Now, obviously, DES is retired now. The key size, 56 bits, is just too small for today's computers. But its legacy isn't really its longevity, it's the process it spawned, right? Why was its public development and eventual retirement so crucial for modern security engineering?
Because it was the first cipher subjected to such intense, open, and sustained attack by the global academic community. Researchers literally invented entirely new classes of attacks just to try and break DES.
Like differential and linear cryptanalysis.
Exactly. Those are the most famous ones. And this whole process proved Kirchhoff's principle right. DES actually resisted these incredibly powerful analytical techniques for decades. It showed the design was fundamentally sound, even if the key length eventually became its Achilles heel due to computational progress.
So that rigorous standardized peer review became the mandatory practice.
Absolutely. It became the benchmark for all subsequent ciphers, like AES, the Advanced Encryption Standard, which replaced DES. You propose a cipher, the world tries to break it. That's the process.
Okay, so let's say we have a perfectly analyzed, mathematically robust primitive, AES, for example. The engineer takes this perfect component, ready to secure some data. Is the job done? Just plug it in?
And that is where the engineering often falls apart, tragically. No, the job is absolutely not done. This brings us to one of the most common and frankly disastrous failure points in practical cryptography. The disaster of mode misuse.
Mode misuse.
Yeah, the security guarantees of the underlying block cipher, that perfect AES algorithm, they can be instantly nullified if you apply it incorrectly. You absolutely have to select the appropriate mode of operation.
We're talking about modes like CBC, cipher blockchaining, CTR counter mode, or maybe GCM, Galois counter mode.
Precisely those, and others like OFB, CFB. The choice is critical.
Explain the difference. Why is choosing the right mode and implementing it correctly so vital?
Well, a block cipher like AES processes fixed-size blocks, usually 128 bits these days. But real-world messages are almost always much longer.
Right. Files, network packets.
Exactly. The mode of operation dictates how you repeatedly apply that block cipher across the entire large message. And the choice often involves some complex engineering trade-offs. You're balancing performance, can it be parallelized, and crucially, the severity of the failure mode when, not if, but when implementation errors occur.
Let's look at a specific common error, the IV reuse vulnerability. This seems like a subtle engineering mistake, just failing to ensure that the initialization vector, the fourth V, is unique for every single message encrypted under the same key. But the consequences, especially in stream cipher modes like, say, output feedback, OFB, or counter mode, CTR, are described as devastating.
Oh, they are catastrophic, utterly catastrophic. In CTR or OFB mode, what happens is the block cipher is used essentially to generate a unique, one-time key stream. This stream is based on the secret key in I. This key stream is then just bitwise XOR'd with the plaintext to produce the ciphertext. It's like a one-time pad, but generated algorithmically.
Right.
Now, if an engineer makes the mistake of reusing an IV with the same key for two different messages, say P-1 and P-2, well, they generate the exact same key stream for both.
Oh, dear. And the moment the attacker gets hold of both resulting ciphertexts, C2 and C2 game over.
Pretty much game over for the confidentiality of those messages. They simply XOR the two ciphertexts together. C2 all plus C22.
Okay, let's break that down. $C P1 obfuscates text stream, and $2 a base P2 pay $2.
Right. So when you XOR them, the identical key stream cancels itself out because anything XORed with itself is 0.
Uh-huh.
P P2 plus K text stream becomes just B2 O plus P22,
You're left with the XOR of the two original plain texts. Wow.
which is functionally equivalent to reusing a perfect one-time pad, a cardinal sin in cryptography.
So if the attacker knows anything about one of the plain texts, maybe it's standard file format or common language.
Exactly. If one plaintext is known, or even partially known, or just contains recognizable patterns like headers, common words, predictable structures, the attacker can potentially derive a lot of information about the entire contents of both encrypted messages almost instantly. The entire security guarantee just collapses completely across the whole length of both messages.
That is a brutal failure mode. Now, contrast that complete catastrophic failure with a mode like, say, cipher blockchaining or CBC.
Mm.
The sources suggest that if an IV is reused in CBC mode, the information leak is much more localized. It's bad, but not as bad. Why does CBC limit the damage?
This is where the chaining mechanism makes a critical difference. In CBC mode, before a plain text block is encrypted, it's first XORed with the previous ciphertext block.
Okay, so each block depends on the one before it.
Precisely. Now, when an IV is reused, yes, the first block of $902 will leak information because they both started with the same IV as the input to that first XOR. But look at the second block.
What happens there?
For the second block, the input to the block cipher for CDR1 involves the first ciphertext block of $C. And for CDR2, the input involves the first ciphertext block of $T.
And unless the first plaintext blocks were identical, those first ciphertext blocks will almost certainly be different.
Exactly. Since PL1 and PL2 are different, CD's first block and CDR2's first block will be different. Therefore, the input to the cipher for the second block diverges rapidly. The chaining mechanism introduces noise and dependency.
That'll scramble things up.
It does. The inputs to the block cipher quickly become uncorrelated and essentially pseudo-random, even starting from the same IV. So if you XOR CDOR and CDOR2 together in CBC mode after an IV reuse, you really only gain significant information about the XOR of maybe the first one or two blocks of plaintext. The error gets localized and scrambled, preventing that clean key stream cancellation that just dooms CTR or OFB.
That's a fascinating trade-off.
It's a crucial engineering trade-off. CBC is slightly slower, it can't be parallelized for encryption easily, but its failure mode under IV reuse is vastly less destructive than CTRs.
Which really explains why the discipline of selecting the correct mode and managing things like IVs rigorously is just as important, maybe even more important in practice, than just picking the strongest underlying algorithm. An engineer has to account for the near certainty of eventual human error or system glitches.
You have to design for resilience against common failures. Okay, so moving from protecting confidentiality, keeping data secret, to protecting data integrity and identity, we arrive at digital signatures. These are often described as the public key analog of message authentication codes, or MO keys.
Right, MAPA keys provide integrity assurance. They tell the recipient that the message hasn't been tampered with since the sender created it, assuming, of course, they share a secret key. But digital signatures offer something more, a unique property that's absolutely essential for things like commerce and law.
That unique property is non-repudiation. It's a powerful concept, because the signature can only be created by the possessor of the secret private key, but it can be verified by anyone using the corresponding public key.
Which is public knowledge.
Which is public knowledge, yes. A signed electronic document, say a contract, a purchase order, can be presented to a neutral third party. Think a bank, a court, maybe a judge. And it serves as undeniable proof that the sender, the holder of that private key, actually signed it. The sender cannot credibly deny authorship later.
They can't repudiate the signature.
Exactly. This ability to prove the origin to a third party is what allows digital signatures to legally replace handwritten signatures in many financial and legal contexts. It's fundamental to trust in digital transactions.
So let's explore the mechanism behind this assurance a bit. Using the Schnorr signature scheme as a modern example, how does a scheme like this, which apparently has roots in zero-knowledge techniques, manage to prove identity without actually revealing the private key itself?
It's a very careful dance between randomness and fixed secrets. When someone wants to sign a message, let's call it $. The signer, who holds the private key, let's call it $, must first generate a fresh, secret, one-time random number.
Let's call it $.
Exactly, a nonce. This $, is absolutely crucial. It acts kind of like a one-time private key, just for the signature. It must be unique and unpredictable for every signature made with the same private key in.
Okay, so you generate the secret random nonce $20. What happens next?
The signer then computes what's called a commitment point, $3. If we're talking elliptic curves, which are common now, this is done by multiplying the nonce $20 by the public base point dollars on the curve. So run equals or RG. This point $2 becomes part of the final signature that gets sent out.
Okay, the commitment to is public.
Yes. Then the signer calculates a challenge hash, let's call it $2. Now, this is not just a hash of the message $2. Critically, it binds the message dollars to the signer's identity, their public key, and to the specific commitment, $10 for this signature. So the hash is calculated as something like HREM. The exact format can vary, but those components are key.
I see. By including the commitment $2 and the public key dollar inside the hash input, you're ensuring this signature is only valid for this specific message from this specific signer using this specific ephemeral random value $2 represented by $2.
Exactly right. It locks everything together. Finally, the signer computes the second part of the signature, the derived value $. This value essentially masks the real private key using the nonce $2 and the challenge hash. The formula is typically $ equals R plus ha.
Ah, so the private key is in there, but it's combined with the nonce $2 and the hash $.
Precisely. The final signature that gets published is the pair, the dollars. This whole complexity, the combination of the ephemeral key $, the long-term secret key, and the message-bound challenge $, is designed to ensure that the private key cannot be trivially recovered. Even if an attacker tries various tricks or collects many signatures, it all relies mathematically on the hardness of the discrete logarithm problem on that curve. It's quite an elegant construction.
It definitely sounds elegant, and it demonstrates how rigorous mathematics provides that non-repudiation guarantee. But, as we know all too well, perfect cryptography doesn't mean much if the trust model surrounding it is broken. Which brings us to the infamous Mallory attack, the classic key management failure.
Ah, Mallory.
Yes.
The Mallory attack is the textbook illustration that often the human element and the key management infrastructure are the weakest links. It typically targets the public key infrastructure, or PKI, the system for distributing and trusting public keys.
So walk us through it. Alice wants to send a secret message to Bob.
Right. Alice needs Bob's public key to encrypt the message so only Bob can read it. She goes to look up Bob's key, maybe in a public directory, a company LD app server, or perhaps it's fetched automatically by her software.
And the attack hinges on Mallory, our malicious actor, being able to interfere with that lookup process.
Exactly. Mallory manages to compromise the key database or directory, or perhaps intercepts Alice's request for the key. What Mallory does is substitute his own public key in place of Bob's public key. Alice, unsuspecting, retrieves Mallory's key, but believes it to be Bob's key. She then proceeds to encrypt her confidential message using Mallory's substituted public key.
So the encryption algorithm works perfectly, AES or whatever she's using, but she's encrypted the message for Mallory, not for Bob.
Precisely. Mallory, who's probably intercepting traffic anyway, grabs the ciphertext. Since it was encrypted with his public key, he can easily decrypt it using his corresponding private key. He reads Alice's secret message.
Nasty. But does he stop there?
No, this is the clever, insidious part. To avoid detection, Mallory takes the original plaintext message he just decrypted, and now he re-encrypts it using Bob's actual real public key, which Mallory probably also looked up.
Ah, so he repackages it for Bob.
Yes. He then forwards this newly encrypted message onto Bob. Bob receives it, decrypts it successfully with his private key, and sees the plaintext message Alice intended to send him.
So from Alice's perspective, she sent a message. From Bob's perspective, he received the message Alice sent. And the source material says neither Alice nor Bob is the wiser, that their supposedly secret communication was intercepted, read, and potentially even modified by Mallory.
Correct. The cryptography itself worked flawlessly at every step. Alice encrypted, Mallory decrypted, Mallory encrypted, Bob decrypted. But the overall system failed completely because the trust layer, the mechanism for reliably associating a public key with the correct entity, was compromised.
It's a really profound lesson, isn't it? A secure protocol has to guarantee security, not just under ideal mathematical conditions, but it also has to be resilient to, or at least account for, the real-world compromise of these non-cryptographic components, like key directories, certificate authorities, and user trust.
Absolutely. You have to consider the whole ecosystem.
And this assumption of non-compromised human competence, or system competence, it extends even deeper into protocol design itself, doesn't it? I'm thinking about key distribution protocols like Yahalom. It's designed trying to establish a shared session key between two parties, say Alice and Bob, using a trusted third-party, Trent.
Yahalom is a classic example. Logically, from a message flow perspective, it seems sound. It uses Trent to mediate the key exchange. But buried within its assumptions is an often overlooked, absolutely critical point: the competence of the participant initiating the key exchange, usually Alice in the protocol diagrams.
What's the assumption?
The protocol implicitly assumes that Alice is, and I quote the source, competent enough to generate good session keys.
Which, in practical terms, means she must generate truly random numbers to form the basis of that session key. And we know that generating true randomness is notoriously difficult in computing.
It's a massive engineering hurdle. Computers are fundamentally deterministic machines. True cryptographic randomness requires reliable sources of entropy physical phenomena, like hardware noise, precise timing variations between unpredictable events, network packet jitter, mouse movements, all sorts of things.
And if Alice's system doesn't do that well, if it generates a weak or predictable session key,
Then the entire security of the subsequent conversation collapses completely,
clearly.
irrespective of how elegant the Yahalom protocol itself is on paper. We see major real-world failures stemming directly from poor entropy sources. The most famous is probably the Debian OpenSSL vulnerability from years back, where a mistaken code change dramatically reduced the entropy pool used for key generation. Keys were generated using only a very limited set of possibilities,
Making them predictable.
making them predictable and breakable. If the underlying seed material, the randomness, is flawed, the entire protocol built on top of it, however theoretically perfect, provides basically zero security. It's another example of the weakest link dominating the outcome.
Okay, we've established that the math provides the proof, the protocols define the structure, but implementation, that's where security often meets its end. Let's shift focus now to maybe the most pervasive and dangerous software problem engineers grapple with today. The sources describe it as the single most pernicious problem in computer security today. What are we talking about?
We're talking, unequivocally, about the buffer overflow and its close relatives, the whole family of memory corruption vulnerabilities used after free, heap overflows, integer overflows that lead to memory issues, and so on.
And these stem primarily from
They're largely an artifact of low-level programming languages like C and C++, languages that, by design for performance reasons, lack intrinsic memory bounds checking. A buffer overflow happens when data being written to a memory buffer like an array exceeds the space allocated for it and spills over, corrupting adjacent data in memory.
Now, there's a constant push in the software development community for open sourcing code. The argument often made is many eyes make all bugs shallow. Does this strategy, while generally beneficial, truly combat these complex security problems like buffer overflows effectively?
Well, open sourcing definitely helps immensely in uncovering what the source calls super obvious bugs and maybe straightforward logic flaws fairly quickly. Automated spanning tools, basic code reviews by many people, they can indeed pick off the most obvious security problems.
But
The source material correctly notes that this strategy often fails to address the really subtle security problems. These complex, exploitable buffer overflows or tricky use after free bugs, they often require a very deep understanding of the specific application's logic, the compiler's behavior, the exact memory layout on the target architecture. Nuances that casual reviews or automated tools frequently miss. Finding them takes expertise and focused effort.
so let's delve into the actual exploitation mechanics then. How does an attacker take what seems like a simple mistake writing, say, 100 bytes into a buffer meant for only 50, and turn that into achieving full, arbitrary code execution on the target machine?
The fundamental goal is always to hijack the program's flow of control, to make the program execute code the attacker wants it to execute instead of what it was supposed to do.
Okay.
The classic method, especially in stack-based overflows, is to overwrite the saved instruction pointer, or program counter, EIP on by 86, RIP on by 64, which is stored on the stack frame. When the vulnerable function finishes and executes its return instruction, instead of jumping back to the legitimate calling code, it reads the overwritten address from the stack and jumps to a memory location specified by the attacker.
And that location typically points to?
Usually points to shellcode, a small piece of machine code the attacker has also managed to inject into the process's memory, maybe even within the overflowing buffer itself if the stack is executable. This shellcode then does the attacker's bidding, like opening a network connection or launching a command shell.
Okay, but what if the stack is protected? Modern systems have defenses against executing code on a stack. Or what if the overflow happens on the heap instead? How does the technique adapt?
Right, defenses evolve. So attackers adapt. If they can't directly execute code on the stack, or if the overflow is elsewhere, they might target function pointers stored in memory. This is often achieved by exploiting flaws that allow writing data to somewhat arbitrary locations in memory, not just adjacent ones.
Give an example.
Okay, for instance, in Unix-like systems, dynamically linked programs often use a structure called the Global Offset Table, or GOT. The GOT contains the actual memory addresses of functions residing in shared libraries, like the standard C library function print.
Okay.
If an attacker, through some memory corruption bug, can overwrite the GOT entry for a commonly used function like print, then the next time the legitimate program tries to call print, the processor looks up the address in the GOT, finds the attacker's address instead, and redirects execution to the attacker's shellcode. The sources note that sometimes the ability to overwrite just a few bytes, often just 4 or 8 bytes for a pointer, at a critical location like this, is frequently enough to achieve full control.
It really highlights this constant arms race between exploit development and defensive programming. It drives this ongoing evolution in code-level mitigations we see.
Absolutely. The engineering community, security researchers, OS vendors, they fought back hard against memory corruption over the years. We've seen critical protections being implemented at both the operating system level and by compilers.
Like stack canaries.
Yes, stack canaries are a great example. Both Linux and Windows kernels and modern compilers can place a secret random value, the canary on the stack, between local variables and the save return address. Before the function returns, it checks if the canary value is still intact. If a buffer overflow has smashed the stock and overwritten the canary, the program detects it and typically aborts immediately, preventing the hijack of the return address.
What about protections designed to make it harder for the attacker to know where to jump to, even if they overwrite a pointer?
That's where address-based layout randomization, or ASLR, comes into play. Kernel ASLR, KSLR, randomizes the memory locations where the core kernel code and data are loaded each boot. For user space applications, you have user space ASLR, which randomizes the base addresses of the stack, the heap, and loaded libraries.
And position-independent executables, PIE.
Right, PIE complements ASLR. It allows the main executable binary itself to be loaded at a random address, not just the libraries. Together, ASLR and PIE make it much harder for attackers to predict the addresses of useful code gadgets or functions needed for techniques like return-oriented programming, ROP, which relies on chaining together small snippets of existing code. If you don't know where the snippets are, you can't chain them.
And then we also have hardware-assisted protections, don't we?
We do. Things like the non-executable bit, NX on Linux BSD, often called Data Execution Prevention or DEP on Windows. This allows the operating system to mark regions of memory, like the stack and heap, as containing only data, not executable code. The CPU itself will then refuse to execute instructions fetched from those regions, which stops many simple shellcode injection attacks dead in their tracks.
And even more advanced things in the kernel.
Yes, especially for protecting the kernel itself, we have things like supervisor mode execution protection, SMEP, and supervisor mode access prevention, SMEPP. These are CPU features that restrict the kernel's ability to accidentally execute code residing in user space memory, SMEP, or even access data in user space memory without explicit intent, SMEP. They significantly complicate the final steps of many privilege escalation attacks, where an attacker tries to get kernel code to run user-controlled code or data.
So as an engineer building software, you can use tools to check if these defenses are enabled for your compiled code.
Definitely. Tools like checksec on Linux can quickly analyze an executable file's headers and tell you if it was compiled with canary support, NX, PIE, and other protections like RailRO, relocation read-only, as part of the modern secure development lifecycle.
Okay, so even when the code is relatively clean, written defensively, and all these compiler and OS mitigations are active, the failure to correctly follow the cryptographic standard itself can still lead to massive vulnerabilities. Let's talk about the SSL-TLS validation failure.
Yes. This is such a common, almost textbook case of engineers performing a check, but forgetting the critical context of the check. When your browser or any client application establishes an SSL or TLS connection to a server, it receives a digital certificate from that server.
And the client has to validate that certificate.
It absolutely must. Now, most implementations successfully perform the easy part of the validation. They check the cryptographic signature on the certificate to verify that it was indeed issued by a trusted certificate authority, or CA one that's in the client's trusted root store. That checks the authenticity of the issuer.
Okay, so that proves the certificate itself is real in the sense that a known CA vouches for it, but that alone doesn't prove the user is actually talking to the server they intended to talk to, right?
Exactly. That is the crucial missing step in so many flawed implementations. The client must also compare the identity information inside the certificate. Specifically, the domain name listed in the certificate's common name, CN field, or more modernly, in the subject alternative names, SEN extension, with the actual domain name the user typed in or clicked on to initiate the connection.
So if I'm trying to connect to mybank.com, the certificate must actually say mybank.com or maybe .mybank.com, somewhere appropriate.
Precisely. If the user expects to talk to securebank.com, but the certificate presented is actually for evil-attacker-site.net, even if that certificate for evil-attacker-site.net was legitimately signed by a recognized CA, the connection must be rejected if the application performs this name matching check correctly.
And if that crucial validation step, the name matching, is skipped or implemented incorrectly, the source material makes a pretty dire claim. Web-based SSL connections are usually trivial to attack. Is it really that bad?
It can be, yes, because if that name check fails, a sophisticated attacker who can position themselves for a man-in-the-middle MITM attack,
Yeah.
maybe they've compromised a local network router or set up a rogue Wi-Fi hotspot, can simply present their own valid certificate. A certificate they legitimately obtained from a CA for domain they control.
Like mybank.com.attacker.net or something.
Or even just totally unrelated-site.com. If the browser or application fails to perform the name matching step and only checks the CA signature, the user might still see a green lock icon or other indicator of a secure connection, because technically the certificate is validly signed. They trust the connection, and the attacker sitting in the middle can then intercept, decrypt, read, and potentially modify all the traffic flowing between the user and the intended server. It fundamentally breaks the end-to-end security promise of TLS. It just demonstrates, again, that cryptographic standards are only effective when all the specified steps are diligently implemented, including the boring but critical context checks. So this constant risk of subtle software flaws, implementation errors, validation failures, it really leads us to a fundamental conclusion in high-security environments. Sometimes the only way to establish a required level of trust is through physical control and specialized hardware, which introduces the necessity of hardware assurance.
And this is the domain of things like hardware security modules, or HSMs. These are dedicated cryptographic processors, right? Used when data is just so sensitive that you simply cannot allow it to touch general-purpose software memory, where these memory corruption attacks or other software bugs might expose it.
That's exactly their purpose. HSMs are designed to manage the most critical secrets imaginable. Think customer-approved PINs for ATMs, the master keys for a payment network, the root signing keys for a certificate authority itself. They are typically kept in physically secure environments like reinforced bank server rooms, often bolted into racks. And they're designed to enforce very strict operational policies.
Like dual control.
Yes, dual control is a key feature, requiring 2 or more authorized individuals to physically interact with the HSM or approve highly sensitive operations, like generating or backing up a master key. This ensures no single employee can unilaterally compromise the most critical secrets. They're also built to be tamper-resistant, or at least tamper-evident. If someone tries to physically break into the device, it's supposed to detect this and securely erase the keys it holds.
Now, a much more controversial and historical example of relying on hardware assurance and also secrecy comes from the U.S. government. The NSA's Clipper chip project back in the 1990s.
Ah, the Clipper chip,
Uh-huh.
formerly the MYK-78T. That was a fascinating and ultimately failed attempt by the U.S. government to essentially control the spread of strong cryptography in the commercial sphere, especially for voice communications. It was a tamper-resistant VLSI chip designed by the NSA.
And it implemented a classified encryption algorithm.
Yes, an algorithm called skipjack, which remained classified for some time. Interestingly, the chip itself was designed to only implement the output feedback mode, OFB, for encryption, which is a streaming mode.
But the real controversy, of course, wasn't just the classified algorithm. It was the fact that it was designed to be tamper-resistant, not just against external attackers trying to get the key out, but also, in a sense, against the user. And it included a deliberate mechanism for government access, the key escrow feature.
Precisely. Clipper had a built-in law enforcement access field, or LEAF, which essentially transmitted a session key, encrypted under special escrow keys held by the government, along with every communication. The idea was that law enforcement, with a warrant, could get the escrowed keys and decrypt conversations. It was a classic example of trying to use security by obscurity the classified skipjack algorithm, combined with hardware control to achieve signals intelligence objectives, even for domestic communications.
And this ties into the NSA's history, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The whole history of U.S. signals intelligence, going way back to the MI8 code-breaking unit in World War I, the subsequent black chamber between the wars, and eventually the creation of the Signal Security Agency during World War II, which then morphed into the modern NSA, it's fundamentally rooted in classified research, code breaking, and maintaining an information advantage. This deep-seated commitment to secrecy naturally leads to the discovery and hoarding of non-disclosed breakthroughs. Knowledge of vulnerabilities in common systems, commercial software protocols, vulnerabilities that the public and the companies making the software are often completely unaware of.
Which creates this profound dilemma, doesn't it? How does a state balance its mandate to protect national security, which often involves intelligence gathering using these secret vulnerabilities, with its obligation to protect its own critical infrastructure, businesses, and citizens who rely on these very same commercial, standardized systems that contain those vulnerabilities?
That tension became incredibly acute and was debated fiercely inside the U.S. government surrounding major cyber operations, particularly the Stuxnet attack targeting Iranian nuclear enrichment centrifuges. Launching Stuxnet was clearly seen as a strategic success by some, but it generated enormous internal debate within both the Bush and Obama administrations because it set such a dangerous global precedent.
And the risk wasn't just the potential diplomatic fallout or Iran retaliating, it was the possibility of blowback from the specific tools used, right? The vulnerabilities themselves.
Exactly. Stuxnet was incredibly sophisticated. It relied on several zero-day vulnerabilities, previously unknown, unpatched flaws in very common Microsoft Windows applications, and also in the specific Siemens SCADA supervisory control and data acquisition software used to control the centrifuges. These were systems used globally.
So the fear was.
The fear among many officials was that by deploying these vulnerabilities offensively in Stuxnet, they risked losing control of them. If the Stuxnet code leaked, or if it was captured and reverse engineered by adversaries, which eventually happened, then the very tools used to attack Iranian infrastructure could immediately come boomeranging back. They could be repurposed and used to attack U.S. businesses, hospitals, power grids, oil and gas pipelines, anything that relied on the same vulnerable Windows systems or Siemens controllers. Hoarding powerful vulnerabilities for offensive use creates this massive, inherent shared risk for the entire global commercial ecosystem that depends on that same software.
Okay, so let's try and bring all these threads together now. This deep dive has really shown us, I think, that cryptography engineering is a field built on these two almost disparate pillars. On one hand, you have rigorous mathematical proofs, the kind that govern number theory, the security of digital signature schemes like Schnorr.
Absolutely. Unshakable mathematical foundations.
And on the other hand, you have standardized practices, the agreed-upon rules for things like block cipher modes of operation, the steps for validating an SSL/TLS certificate properly.
Right, the practical application guidelines. And we've seen again and again how often the whole structure collapses, not because the math failed. It's very rare for Zane to suddenly behave unexpectedly,
Yeah.
but because the engineering discipline failed.
Yeah.
Whether it's a programmer failing to avoid a buffer overflow in C code, or someone reusing a non-unique IV in CTR mode, or an application developer omitting that single critical contextual step of validating the domain name against the SSL certificate. The security chain is always defined by its weakest link, and that link is very often non-cryptographic. It's human error, it's process failure, it's incomplete implementation.
And that tension we discussed between the open scrutiny advocated by Kirchhoff's principle, which drives global security standards forward, and the practice of national security secrecy, which often involved hoarding knowledge of vulnerabilities, that tension seems completely unresolved. Openness builds strong defenses for everyone, but classification aims for strategic advantage, creating this immense blowback risk for the very systems the public relies on daily.
That tension is only amplified in today's hyper-connected digital landscape. As we know, the internet has no real borders, and consequently, cyber attacks are inherently transnational events. We saw the terrifying cost of these shared vulnerabilities play out with the NotPetya attack in 2017.
NotPetya. That started as a seemingly targeted attack against Ukrainian entities, didn't it? Using exploits, specifically Eternal Blue, that had allegedly leaked from classified U.S. government stockpiles.
That's right. But because the underlying vulnerability exploited by Eternal Blue was in a very common file-sharing protocol used by Windows systems everywhere, NotPetya didn't stay contained. It spread like wildfire, automatically and indiscriminately.
affecting huge multinational corporations, ports like Maersk, hospitals, critical systems far, far beyond its initial geopolitical target. Across Europe, Russia, the Americas, the economic damage was colossal.
It was a stark demonstration. Every single implementation flaw in widely used software that gets weaponized by a state actor, it risks becoming a global digital pandemic once that exploit inevitably leaks or gets repurposed. The shared infrastructure means shared risk.
Which leaves us with our final provocative thought for you, our listener. Whether you're an engineer writing code, a CISO managing risk, or a policymaker setting rules. When critical infrastructure power grids, water supplies, financial systems, and ordinary personal systems worldwide rely on the exact same commercial applications, and when flaws in those applications are actively sought out and exploited by sophisticated state-level offensive teams, what fundamental responsibility does the engineering community and maybe national governments bear for the security of systems that are simultaneously just commercial products and also essential targets in global cyber conflict?
How do we, collectively, prioritize building robust, globally secure standards and practices over the perceived short-term strategic advantage of holding on to undisclosed vulnerabilities? What's the right balance between national security interests and global digital stability?
It's a really delicate balance of knowledge, responsibility, and risk. Something to think about until our next deep dive.